Hello everyone, welcome to Eye on Africa. Here are your headlines on this Friday. Zimbabwe's government holds a mass demonstration to rally support against sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union. We'll go live to Harare in just a moment. The police commissioner of Ethiopia's Oromia region says 67 people have been killed in 2 days of protests this week. Violence erupted after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed accused a prominent journalist of fueling ethnic violence. And how a forest in Kenya went from a hotbed of crime to a runner's paradise. That story coming up. But first, Zimbabweans have staged massive protests against sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union. The demonstrations were organized by the government and aimed to put pressure on the West to lift sanctions that have weighed down on the country's economy for years. The punitive measures had been put in place during Robert Mugabe's rule and were aimed at high-ranking officials and government institutions, including travel bans on Mugabe and his inner circle. And last March, Donald Trump extended the penalties to more than 100 individuals and entities, including Zimbabwe's current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. Here's what he had to say during Friday's march.
These unjustified and oppressive illegal sanctions continue to cause untold suffering to the ordinary people of our great country. The government has resolved to victory operate from hand to mouth.
Let's go live now to Harare for more. Ryan Truscott joins us from the Zimbabwean capital. Ryan, good evening. How much support did today's demonstrations get from Zimbabweans?
Well, the First Lady, Ethiopia Mnangagwa, led government supporters, a few thousand of them, through central Harare this morning. They carried placards denouncing sanctions. They sang and chanted their way to the National Sports Stadium, which was the main venue. But even so, it did take time for the stadium to fill. And I think that critics will probably see those empty seats as a snub of the government and evidence that many Zimbabweans don't totally agree with the government's claim that sanctions are to blame for the economic problems. Trains and buses had been provided to bring people to Harare from the country's 10 provinces, and a holiday had been declared today, so banks and businesses were shut. So the sparse attendance, at least in the initial stages, did come as something of a surprise. The opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa of the MDC, did say today that Zimbabwe's problems stem from what he called a failed leadership and bad governance, and not from sanctions.
Ryan, we're going to show you show our viewers this tweet from the British ambassador to Zimbabwe saying earlier today, EU restrictive measures are only on the Mugabes and the Zimbabwe defense industries. The UK stands with Zimbabweans in the fight against corruption and rights abuses. That is where the government should focus its efforts, and also a hashtag, the UK stands with Zim. But local organizations and even the Southern African development community have claimed the effects of sanctions go well beyond the so-called targeted individuals. Are everyday Zimbabweans affected by these sanctions?
Well, Zimbabweans are struggling, but that's because of the horrendous economic situation. There are power cuts, fuel shortages, rising prices. And I think that almost all government opponents would say it's due to years and years of mismanagement and corruption. Western countries have been clear that individuals put under sanctions as far back as 2002 and 2003 were being punished for rights abuses. Certainly in terms of travel bans, it meant that these individuals were prevented from going to spend ill-gotten money in foreign capitals. There were ways around this, of course. Former First Lady Grace Mugabe used to go shopping during UN conferences, for instance, but there are some voices that say sanctions don't achieve that much and, in fact, give the government a convenient scapegoat to blame for its mismanagement.
All right, Ryan Truscott in Harare. Ryan, thank you very much. Moving on now to Ethiopia, where authorities say at least 67 people, including 5 police officers, have been killed this week during outbreaks of violence that have rocked the region of Oromia. That is according to the police commissioner. The unrest began on Wednesday when protests broke out after prominent activist and journalist Jawar Mohammed said the government was trying to remove his bodyguards. Earlier in the week, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who won the Nobel Peace Prize earlier this month, had accused Jawar's media outlet of stoking ethnic violence. Laurent Berstecher has the details.
accusing Ethiopia's prime minister of behaving like a dictator. High-profile activist Jawar Mohammed, the man at the center of protests that have rocked the country for days, hinted he might run against Abiy Ahmed in 2020.
I want to have an active role in the coming election. In what capacity, I'm not sure, but I want to make sure that the influence I have in the country has positive contribution.
On Wednesday, Mohammed accused security forces of trying to orchestrate an attack against him, a claim that police denied. This sparked violent protests in the capital, Addis Ababa, and several other cities, in which over a dozen people were killed. Tensions seemed to cool on Friday as the army deployed troops throughout the country to restore order. Yet the scale of the unrest highlighted the extent of Mohammed's influence. A US-educated activist, Jawar Mohammed gained popularity after founding the Oromo Youth Association in 2006 and was credited with organizing protests that brought Abiy Ahmed to power last year. He's since become critical of the prime minister, accusing him of centralizing power, silencing dissent, and jailing political opponents. But on Friday, he appeared to extend an olive branch, saying he could still be convinced to back Ahmed if he changed course.
Let's take a quick look now at some other stories making headlines across the continent. The president of the Central African Republic says his country is considering hosting a Russian military base and would like Moscow to supply it with new weapons. François Faustin Archange Touadéra made the comments that day after delegates from all 54 African nations took part in a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Sochi. Putin had hailed a new page in relations at the end of the event and said he wanted to strengthen economic relations with the continent. The UN's top humanitarian official says Nigerian authorities must do more to tackle the humanitarian situation in the northeastern part of the country. Communities in the region have been devastated by a decade-long jihadist conflict, with 140,000 people forced to flee their homes just this year. Nigeria's military has managed to regain control of large parts of Borno State, but the UN says authorities must do more to address the root causes of the conflict, help locals, and contribute to developing that part of the country. Thousands of protesters out in the streets of Algeria once again this Friday. For the 36th consecutive week, demonstrators gathered across the country to voice their anger and frustration at the political elite and reiterated their commitment to boycott presidential elections scheduled for December 12th. The deadline for candidates wishing to take part in the race is Saturday. Protesters also lashed out at interim President Abdelkader Ben Salah, who told Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday that the situation in Algeria was under control and that the protest movement was a minor story. The president of the Algerian League for Human Rights called the remarks a humiliation for the Algerian people. And Botswana's Chief Justice confirmed on Friday that Mokgweetsi Masisi had won a 5-year term after his ruling party secured 51% of parliamentary votes. Masisi thanked voters and said he was humbled to serve them for the next 5 years. The main opposition protested the outcome, saying the vote had been massively rigged and did not deserve any respect. The Botswana Democratic Party has ruled the country since it gained independence from Britain in 1966. Finally tonight, what was once a refuge for the city's thugs and criminals where dead bodies would turn up on a daily basis has now been transformed into one of Nairobi's safest and most visited locations. Laurent Bersacher takes us on a tour of Karura Forest in the Kenyan capital.
It may look like a haven for nature lovers, but for years, Nairobi's Karura Forest was known as a no-go zone. Crawling with bandits, riddled with crime and dead bodies, it was the stuff of urban legends, a place where you threatened to send your children if they misbehaved.
No one would even want to be threatened to be taken to Karura. Because it meant either you're going to be killed or that you're going to get a punishment.
When John Chije became Karura's first chief scout in 2009, he decided it was time to reclaim the forest. He and his team installed an electric fence around the perimeter and for years volunteered to run alongside nervous joggers to help them feel safe. 10 years later, Chije's work is beginning to pay off. Karura has become one of Nairobi's safest and most popular destinations, a green refuge in one of Africa's fastest developing cities that attracts up to 30,000 visitors each month.
We have promised and vowed to keep it safe and secure for the betterment of the current and coming generation.
Local mentalities have also begun to change. For years, nearby slum dwellers used the forest as a garbage dump and an open toilet. Today, many have become its custodians, planting trees, cleaning weeds, and patrolling its borders.
That does it for this edition of Eye on Africa. Coming up next, Live from Paris continues with Sanam Chantier right after this short break. Stay tuned.